Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Douglas Murray, and I'm going to speak first for this session. Vivek's going to follow me, then we're going to have a discussion and hopefully open out some of the questions that come up. We're going to be talking this morning about meritocracy. It seems a pretty good time to talk about that in America. Let me preface, by the way, saying what a pleasure it is for me to be here with National Review, with the National Review Institute, and what a pleasure it is to be with Vivek, to whom I wish all luck.
I'll take it. Thank you.
Some years ago at an event in London, my friend, the British historian Andrew Roberts, who some of you may know, was asked by a visiting dignitary, if you were to be made Prime Minister, Andrew Roberts, what would you do? And Andrew was kind enough to say, my first act would be to make Douglas the minister in charge of education and public enlightenment. And I said, and war. And ever since, it's been my request to everyone I know running for office. So again, Vivek, I would like that portfolio
I'll think about it.
to be put to one side. It adds a certain level of menace to the issue of education, which I think it lacks. But anyhow, the issue of meritocracy in America and the wider West at the moment is a fascinating issue because we're totally torn on it. Let me attempt to sort of mend part of that tear in the following phrase. You all know the idea of straw manning. If you don't know the idea of straw manning, you should see my recent debate with Malcolm Gladwell in Canada, where he gave a superb masterclass in what it is to straw man an opponent's argument. I want to do the opposite of that on the issue of meritocracy and steel man the argument. What is the argument that we could actually agree on as the issue in meritocracy in a society like ours in America? And I would say that it's something like this, that nobody should be held back from attaining whatever it is that they can attain by dint of their virtues and achievements simply because of some characteristic over which they have no say. Something like that. It may not be perfect, it's something like that that we're aiming for. That the idea of a meritocracy is that nothing should hold you back if you have the capabilities to fulfill your goals. So if you have the capacity to be on the board of a company, you shouldn't not be on the board because you're gay or because you're a woman or because you're from ethnic minority. The interesting thing about this is I think we have almost total unanimity in a society like America about that question. If you look at the polls, almost nobody doesn't agree with the aim as I've just set it out. That nothing should hold you back if you have the capability simply because of something which you have no say over. The problem about this is, and one of the reasons why America in particular is so confused about the issue of meritocracy in the 21st century, is because left and right have arrived at very different ideas of how to address this question. Now, there's a critique of the right's attitude, but let me roughly lay out what I see as the right's attitude. The right's attitude on this question is something like this. It's a gradualist approach. And this has an enormous amount to be said for it. We've heard from educationalists and others, and we will do later today. The gradualist approach is that if we set up, if not the optimal conditions, at least as optimal conditions as we can set up, then this society in which people can achieve and flourish whatever their own characteristics, wherever they've started from, will occur. To my mind, it remains the best answer. However, there is a critique of it. And the critique, largely, comes from the left, says it's complacent. And among other things, it takes too long. So, in recent years, the left, again, particularly in America, has been busying itself away with its own attempt to address this question. Sometimes in good faith, very often not. And its answer, of course, is equity. Its answer is, we will not reach that point of meritocratic goal unless we actually live in a country in which, by the way, only high-status professions can be demonstrated to show equity. So, for instance, we will base our ideas on a whole set of industries and accomplishments on Hollywood. Brilliant. Take the least representative part of society in which people only advance because they're attractive, very rarely because of their intelligence. Take that bit of society, roll it out, complain that this female actress only got 20 million, poor thing, where the male actor got 25 million, and claim that no one will be free unless this multi-millionairess gets the same salary as the Top Gun actor or whatever. Another example is boards. I mentioned them earlier. People in America now on the meritocratic issue are obsessed with boards. Most people in America, of course, do not spend their lives sitting on company boards. There was a recent, as Vivek can I'm sure address, there was recent legislation a few years ago in California which insisted that companies, if they were going to be publicly registered in California, had to have certain representation on the boards from certain minorities. And there were certain ethnic minorities they insisted must be on them, including Pacific Islanders. Oh, and also trans people. And I got a friend of mine, I'm not a math guy, I'm a know-nothing humanities type. And, but I got a math friend of mine to crunch the numbers on this. And we worked out that if the number of companies in California remained what they are now, which doesn't seem likely, but were that to happen, if you are a Pacific Islander who lives in California or a trans person who lives in California, you should clear your diary for the 2020s. You are going to be dashing from board meeting to board meeting. You're going to be doing the petroleum companies in the morning. You're going to have to be doing every university in the afternoon. It's going to be no fun. But the point is that we have weirdly decided that these things, like as I say, high-status professions, board membership, are the things that unless we get 50% or more female representation on boards, nobody in America is free. Unless we get precisely the number of African Americans on the board, or preferably higher, nobody is free, etc., etc. What are some of the things you lose in this? Just one of the things you lose, of course, is any focus on non-high status professions. Absolutely nobody on the American left, so far as I know, is bothered by the fact that most of the people who lay tarmac on the roads and the highways of America are men. Almost nobody is demanding more trans road layers. Almost nobody is demanding more female workers on pylons to fix when the electricity cables all go and risk their lives doing that. And almost nobody argues that. It's only the high-status professions. And this tells us something, I think, very revealing about what we actually are prioritizing in modern America. Now, what should we be doing? It seems to me, and I've been writing about this recently, it seems to me that we are at great risk in America in particular at the moment of falling into what in the Middle Ages was known as accidie. Accidie was a condition that writers including Chaucer and Dante and others wrote about. It was about a sort of listlessness. And in the Middle Ages, accidie was recognized to be very dangerous for an individual and utterly fatal for a society. That is, the question of what we should be doing was effectively unaddressed. Now, I'm not checking my text messages, I promise. I was very interested in a poll the Wall Street Journal carried out earlier this week, which some of you I'm sure will have seen, which speaks to this issue of accidie. just in the last 25 years, the last quarter of a century, living memory for all of us, the number of Americans who said that patriotism was, quote, very important to them, fell from 70%, 70%, to 38%. Number of people who said that religion was very important to them fell from 62% to just 27%. The number of Americans who believe that tolerance is an important virtue fell from 80% 4 years ago to just 58% today. 4 years. 4 years to lose that number of Americans who believe in the idea of tolerance. I would submit that when we address issues like meritocracy, we on the right have to bear in mind the following single thing, and I'll finish with that before handing over to Vivek. We have to recognize that the left has offered a totalistic explanation for human behavior. A totalistic explanation that, as I say, you will not be free until all of these odd things we've selected show representation. You must fight, and you must struggle, and you must strive, and you must insult, and you must degrade, and you must cut people off in your lives, and much more. That's something to do. That's something to do. It is an extremely ugly thing to do, but it's something to do. And we, on the right, it seems to me, need to spend much more of our time not simply picking apart what the left is saying that we should do, but providing answers of our own, saying this is what it would look like to have a successful life in the 21st century. This is what the aim should be. You shouldn't be playing the games that the left has invited you to play, totally unwinnable games. You should be doing the following things. That seems to me, and maybe we can get on to this, to be an aspiration worth struggling for in this century. Thank you.
What was that word? What was that word for listlessness?
Acidity.
Thank you, Douglas, for laying a foundation that I'll just pick up on. Actually, I'll talk about something a little bit different than I was planning to, because I think that there's something deep to Douglas's observation in a discussion about meritocracy, to talk about the relationship between merit, or the loss of merit, and this new acidine, listlessness in American society. I'll tell you, actually, when I launched this presidential campaign, one of the things that I said was it was time to put the merit back into America. And I'm a big believer that language often teaches us something about the truth of what language actually describes. And so I was convinced that there was going to be actually a linguistic tie between even the word merit and America. It just seems so part of the fabric of what it meant to be American that the coincidence seemed too convenient that these two things were even similar sounding. So I did a little homework in the weeks thereafter. I first got to a disappointing conclusion. Actually, in the first instance, they didn't have the same linguistic origin. America was named after, in part, there's actually competing explanations, but Amerigo Vespucci, the famous explorer, one of the first people to come to the Western Hemisphere. And Amerigo Vespucci was named in turn after his grandfather, and that name derived actually from his grandfather. His name was derived from a Gothic word called Amalric. So it seemed like I was out of luck there. But then I got to the heart of what does Amalric mean, actually. Amalric is two words. Rick means master. Okay, it means the master, but then the master of what? Amal actually stands for work. So if you think about the root and the genesis of the American name itself, it is he who is the master of work itself. And to me, the idea of work, hard work, effort as a means to achieving success is actually inextricably linked to that idea of merit in itself. And so I think that there was a way in which even the language teaches us the way in which merit is itself part of the American fabric. I think that I'll rise to hopefully address the challenge that Douglas laid out for our movement at the end of his remarks, which is that we have spent enough time in our movement, myself included, even Douglas too, if I'm to call both of us out, on pointing out the endless hypocrisies of the other side, in identifying the way in which the weight of the left's own hypocrisies crumble under the weight of its nonsense. But I think that now is the moment where we rise to the occasion to provide an affirmative alternative vision of our own, because as that Wall Street Journal survey last week demonstrated, we are in the middle of this national identity crisis, where if you ask most people our age, really any age in this country, what does it mean to be American? What does it mean to be meritocratic? You get a blank stare in response. And I think that's evidence of the fact that we've lost the sources of identity that used to fill our hunger for purpose and meaning as a generation. And I think that's what creates this black hole of a void that allows wokeism or gender ideology, or for that matter, climatism or COVIDism, new secular cults that arise one at a time to fill that void, to prey on that void, where I think we can actually fill that void with the answer to the question of what it even means to be an American in the year 2023. And if we can do that, then we dilute these alternative ideologies to irrelevance. And my view is the heart of what it means to be American is that you believe in merit. I'm going to make a strong claim here. I think that merit is the unifying idea that actually gives us our American identity, and it shows up in many different spheres of our lives. It does mean it's woven into the fabric of the American dream. The idea that no matter who you are or where your parents came from or what your skin color is, that you can achieve anything in this country with your own hard work, your own commitment, and your own dedication. That is the heart of the American dream. And while we as conservatives, me as a presidential candidate, will say that we will get rid of affirmative action in America and race-based affirmative action, that's something that, by the way, we can end in this country with the stroke of a pen from the White House. That's something that can be done. Why do we want to do it? It's because race-based affirmative action is itself an assault on the character of our national soul. It is anti-meritocratic at its core. Now, that much is obvious. But the case I'd like to make is that that idea of merit shows up in other spheres of our lives in ways that might not be obvious either. Take our commitment to free speech in this country. A big part of what's enshrined in our, not just the protections against the government intrusion on individual liberty, but in the culture of free speech that our founding fathers set into motion, was actually a commitment to the meritocracy of ideas itself. What does that mean? What is merit in the realm of ideas? It means the best ideas win. But the best ideas only win when no ideas are censored. Right? You think about what was the best idea in how to deal with the unknown COVID pandemic. It was unknown. None of us knew exactly what that was going to look like in the first few months of that pandemic. Well, now we know in retrospect that some of the best ideas would have included leaving our schools open, even if we were taking steps to protect elder Americans. But that idea couldn't win. The best ideas cannot win when some ideas are censored. So that, too, is, I think, something that our founders knew, and that's not a different topic relating to free speech and constitutional liberty. I would make the case that merit is a common thread that runs through that very idea. What does meritocracy in government mean? To think about a different sphere of what the Constitution enshrines. Part of what we enshrined in 1776 in this country was that the people who we elect to run the government ought to be the people who actually run the government. That's what's enshrined in a three-part constitutional division of labor. And so what does merit mean there? Merit means that you earn, whoever is best at earning the trust, as amalgamated and counted in the form of votes, is most meritocratically suited to actually run the country. I speak to you on a day where, whatever you think of the man, we have a prosecutor that's trying to intervene in that system and saying the people of this country should not be given that choice. An administrative state in this town that actually views the elected officials that sit at the White House down the street as an inconvenience because it is the unelected class that today actually holds the keys to power. Yes, that goes to the idea of self-governance over aristocracy, but I think this idea of merit itself is woven into the American fabric even in ways that you wouldn't think about it, not just in the American dream, but in our culture of free speech, not just in our culture of free speech, but even in the way we set up our system of constitutional self-governance in this country. I'll tell you, as a first-generation American, as the kid of immigrants who came to this country, this is personal to me. My dad came to this country in the late 1970s, not with a lot of money in his pocket, very little actually, to Southwest Ohio, where I grew up as a skinny kid with nerdy glasses and a funny last name. And I'll tell you, everybody runs into their version of hardship, but part of what my parents taught me was that hardship is not the same thing as victimhood. Hardship is part of what teaches you who you really are. So yeah, did I stand out? I went to actually it was majority black or close to majority black, not all that well-to-do public school from 1st through 8th grade. Got bullied around a little bit as a nerdy academic kid that was focused on science and math, as my parents, I think gratefully now push me to be. My dad had a saying for me. He said, if you're going to stand out, you might as well be outstanding. And for me, achievement was my ticket to get ahead in this country, to then become the kid of immigrants who came to this country with almost no money, to go on to found multi-billion-dollar companies, and then to hopefully pass on those same values to my children. That's deeply personal to me, but it's not just personal to me as a first-generation American. I think no American actually hears the word merit for the first time if they're raised in the American way. They already know it in the way that they were raised and brought up. And I think that's a big part of the shared national identity that we've lost. So when you hear a survey, and I'll close with this before we go to our conversation, in the Wall Street Journal that says we've lost our sense of patriotism, what does that actually mean? It means that we've been tricked, and I think we have been. It's a form of being duped. We've been duped, we've been tricked into celebrating not just equity, but the philosophy embedded in equity, diversity, capital D, diversity, to celebrate all of the ways in which we are different, in ways that caused us to forget all of the ways in which we are really the same, bound together by a common set of principles that set this nation into motion 250 years ago. That's what's enshrined in the bottom of every one of the coins that embody in physical form the system of what capitalism represents. At the bottom of every one of those coins, it says, e pluribus unum, from many, one. And I think one of the things that makes it difficult for, even when I'm talking to young people, explaining what those common set of ideals are is, on one hand, there's so many of them. Free speech, self-governance over aristocracy, the rule of law. We can go down each of the amendments in the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, and explain what that means to them. But I've found that actually one of the easier ways to explain it is sometimes you can just give them the one common thread that runs through the whole thing, and that is this idea of merit and restoring meritocracy in every sphere of our lives, from the economy to education to who runs the government to even which ideas win. And I am confident that if we're able to put that merit back into America, that's not just about allowing and creating a culture that allows people to thrive and achieve their greatest dreams through the system of capitalism or any other, but it is also, I think, our best chance of reviving a missing national identity when we long for one. So thank you for your time this morning, and I'm looking forward to the conversation and diving deeper with Douglas. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Vivek. Let me kick us off before we get on to the positive bits of it. Let's deal still for a moment on some of the negatives. I loved your idea that merit is a unifying idea in America. It seems to me, at any rate, anyone who doesn't guess from my accent knows I'm not from these shores. It seems to me, at any rate, that this is still prevalent in America to a greater degree than it is in Europe, for instance. The idea that achievement is not a zero-sum game, and if this guy makes some money, it's not to my detriment, it's to everyone's advantage. So I love the idea that merit is a unifying idea in this country. We have a very concrete case coming up, which is, of course, the Harvard admissions case. I was at Harvard the other week and was gathering that it seems like the Supreme Court will probably issue its verdict on this before the summer recess. If, as a lot of people think, Harvard is found to have been doing something illegal, then almost every institution of higher education in America will have been found to have been over the same line. What do you think happens if the verdict does indeed go that way?
So if I were on the board of a university, and I'm not currently on the board of a university, I think it would be financially irresponsible if you weren't setting aside some reserve for litigation right now. And I think that's going to be a good thing in disciplining as a function these universities that have engaged in systematic discrimination of a kind that history will judge very poorly. It is an ugly form of discrimination. Not that different. In Harvard, it's my alma mater, so I'll be gloves off in my criticism. What they did to Jews 50 years ago that they'll apologize for today, that is what they're doing actively today. The effect is on Asian Americans. History will not judge that kindly, and I think that that's going to come with real legal teeth and consequences, and their accountability, I think, is a precondition for justice. And so I think that accountability is going to come in the form of a wave of lawsuits that these universities should set aside or reserve for. I think that'll actually even be good because it's going to put more financial pressure on an educational industrial complex that itself should be called out, including with the Department of Education here lurking behind the scenes, artificially subsidizing four-year college education institutions that have become this corrupt. So I hope, actually, I'm rooting for a form of creative destruction here, that this unleashes a wave of, and you want to do the math on this, these liabilities can be quite uncapped, that actually financially punish universities for engaging in the kinds of behaviors they have. That financial accountability then triggers revealing the way in which the entire system was based actually on a large farce of the value and the inflated value and subsidized value, artificially subsidized value for your college education that really delivers a much needed reckoning to higher education itself. That's what I'm rooting for, and I can tell you, I'm not just going to be passively rooting for it. In whatever capacity I'm in, 2 years from now, I think that there's ways we can use this finally to deliver the wake-up call to fixing a broken higher education system in this country.
Yes, it does seem that, it's been an enormous boon to the HR departments, all of this.
Of course it is.
Stanford, which had such a fine reputation until recent weeks, Stanford, it turned out there is roughly one HR person on staff or faculty for every student. It would be cheaper to get everyone a butler and much more useful. And it would make me want to go to Stanford. But one of the great scandals that has to be addressed in this country is how you have people coming out of university in ever more debt, paying for these vast bureaucracies of bureaucrats, and every year, year on year, being stupider and stupider. Something has to give at some point, does it not?
It does. I think you've put your finger on the right pulse. It is not an accident that this correlates with rise in college tuition, actually.
Yeah.
So in Woke Inc., my first book, I cited this at Michigan State, but may as well have been many other universities too. There's been an order of magnitude, so 10x, explosion in the ratio of administrative staff to students. And so the rise of this managerial bureaucracy is part of what creates this anti-meritocratic force in all of our institutions, by the way. I talked about it in government, right? The administrative state does to government what the managerial class does to the university. What increasingly you see happening in the HR ranks of corporate America too. Now, there's a linkage between these things. Okay, so Lyndon Johnson set into motion the Great Society, which is the biggest misnomer in I think, American history for what it's done for even the very people it was supposed to protect, in many cases black Americans. But one of the things he set into motion was the executive order that created affirmative action in America. By the way, if a US president can create it by executive order, you can end it by executive order. We need to remember that and hold Republicans accountable for that. But here's actually what happened, is with the civil rights statutes, we ended up protecting attributes like race and gender and sexual orientation. Now, how does that relate to some of the other travails we see in America? It goes back to actually the anti-meritocratic culture even creates an assault on free speech. I can tell you on how that happens both in universities and in corporate America, where now those statutes are read so broadly that if you now say something that's even, it's not even just about anti-meritocratic hiring, if you say something that is deemed to be hostile to or experienced as hostile by a member of a protected class, that is creating a hostile work environment. That's what these HR deputies are there to police. They're even legally required to it. And so if they allow that person to speak in a way that creates a hostile work environment for someone who's a member of a protected class, then that could be a basis for a Title VII violation or a civil rights violation under the civil rights statutes. Well, what does that mean? We've created the very conditions then for viewpoint discrimination while leaving political expression itself unprotected. And so these concepts between the assault on free speech, which itself is part of a meritocracy of ideas, is actually deeply related to the assault on merit in hiring itself, and the managerial bureaucracy that administers the latter is actually responsible for creating the anti-speech conditions in the former. And so it's not an accident. People wonder, why do we see these malaises rise at the same time? You think free speech culture assault and cancel cultures over here, and anti-meritocratic stuff and affirmative action and DEI bureaucracies are over here. No. It's not a coincidence. These are deeply linked, and if we get to that root cause with an affirmative alternative vision of our own, then we can stand on strong moral and principled footing to not only gut that system, but create a new one to take its place.
Let me lead us on to what's perhaps one of the most awkward parts of this conversation, which is we talk most of the time in discussions about meritocracy about the people who can and the people who can succeed. Of course, in any society, but particularly in a democracy like America, you have a flip side of that problem. You said, I was very struck by it, hardship is not the same thing as victimhood. I couldn't agree more, but we do live in a society in which victimhood is the main goal. To be a victim and to be on the victim hierarchy, to have the delicious opportunity to be the most victimized person is clearly the aspiration. We've all seen it in our lives when people pick up the microphone in a Q&A and they say, speaking as, and I think, everything that's going to come afterwards is going to be garbage. And then they'll say something about their lived experience, as if there's any other kind of experience. Sort of, in my unlived experience. But we do have this problem, particularly in America, that the seeking of victimhood in our own lifetimes, and you wrote about this obviously in both of your books, but in our own lifetimes we've moved, in America in particular, which is so striking, from a culture of heroism to a culture of victimhood. And if I can lay out very quickly, there's one particular problem in this, in a democracy, which is something which I quote Nietzsche a little bit in my most recent book, In the War on the West, and whenever a student says to me that they're a fan of Nietzsche, I always say, oh yeah, which bits? You've got to think it's worth using carefully. But I used rather carefully Nietzsche's work on the genealogy of morals for my last book, and there's one particular insight of his that really struck me and is pertinent to our situation and to our discussion today, which is this. Nietzsche talks about the type of person who, he says, a person of resentment, who, among other things, and see if anyone can recognize this type in the society we're now in, among other things, tears, he says, at wounds long since healed and then cries about their hurt. Now, Nietzsche says there's one particular problem, which is that the person of resentment needs somebody to stand over their lives and make a correction, but it's not even clear to Nietzsche who that person should be. It's not clear to me who it should be. Nietzsche ends up talking about the person maybe being a secular priest, is the term he uses, quite an interesting term. But he says that somebody must stand over the life of the person of resentment and say to them at some point, you are right. You have reason to be resentful. There is somebody who has ruined your life. There is somebody who has held you back. The person is you. Now, that is probably the least pleasant thing to hear, and probably one of the hardest things to ever say. How can a politician, should a politician, say to certain people, you know, you have screwed up your life, and it's been your responsibility and your fault. You could turn it around, but if you don't want to, you'll still be the only person to blame.
I think here's how I would say it. It is still in your power to turn it around, but that is your choice to make. I think hardship is not a choice. Victimhood is a choice.
Yes.
And the best a politician can do, certainly a president can do, is at least to create the conditions in a country where we don't create the incentives for people to choose victimhood. And so would I, if I'm speaking as a national leader here, would I point to the person and say it is your fault? I would say it the other way. I think it is our fault for creating a culture, including the economic incentives that backstop it, for you to make the choice that you are making today, to be a victim rather than to be a victor, okay? Now, we will do our part and fix that on the expectation that you will then do yours. And I think that is the kernel, thank you, for a national revival in this country. I think it makes the difference. That single trade will make the difference of whether we are Rome, or more likely, look at how long we've been alive as a country, more likely whether we are Carthage, or whether we're just a little young, going through our version of adolescence. Adolescence is a period where, even absent those government incentives, there's something about adolescence that makes you want to see yourself as a victim of your parents, of your conditions, of your high school peers, right? There's something about this is woven into nature, too. It's not just a governmental citizenry relationship. It's something within each of us. Well, we're going through that version of adolescence as a nation right now. And I think in the good version of this, where we have leaders that are willing to change that incentive structure and to boldly look their citizenry in the eye and speak that hard truth back to them, set the expectation of what we expect of citizens. The idea of being a citizen entailing a duty. Part of that duty is to look within, not to blame the other, but ask about what I can do myself. Well, if we're able to do that, then I think as a nation itself, we will, too, get through our version of adolescence and be stronger on the other side of it. As there were many rises and many falls of Rome, actually, that's one of the secrets of history. There was no one rise and fall of Rome. There were many rises and many falls. I think we may still be ahead of the next rise in the American experiment. I truly believe that. I think it depends on the leaders who we have who are willing to speak that hard truth.
I'm so glad that you said that about adolescence in America. It comes much better from your mouth than from mine. I was brought up to believe, as Jessica Mitford once said, we weren't taught much about American history in Britain. What we were taught was that basically the Americans had done something unspeakable in the 18th century, and we preferred not to talk about it. Very embarrassing for them. But let me just, two points that we really should hit on before we wrap up. The first, let me bring us onto a sort of metaphysical point before I bring us onto a more practical one. Metaphysical point is this. You mentioned the issue of free speech a couple of times. It seems to me that the great problem that exists in that regard in America is that we've lost confidence in the idea that free speech leads to truth.
Yes.
Because we've lost the idea of truth. We've lost the idea that this battle of ideas, this knocking of stone on flint refines things. You get to the point. It seems as though we're actually trying to avoid the point. As though, I mean, look at all of the words that the modern academy has used. Problematize, an extraordinarily ugly word. We have problematized a lot of things. Fantastic. Have you answered anything? Not yet. We have created problems that didn't exist 20 years ago and are endlessly going to fiddle with them. But the idea that we need speech, we need inquiry, because we will get to a truth, and that truth exists, seems to be one of the underlying things that has fallen away.
I agree with you. You're right over the flame with truth, actually, and the rejection of truth. Now, I think this puts pressure, helpfully, on the partisan political framework through which we're taught to see the actual divides in this country. Because where you began, Douglas, in your remarks, when you were speaking, was actually on the idea that the left and the right differ on how to achieve a world in which those who are endowed with whatever their talent is are permitted to achieve it. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that, but there's also a strain in this country that rejects that as an objective in its own right, that doesn't disagree about the means but disagrees about the end itself. And so it's actually, though I run for president as a Republican, it's the least important part of it is that label. I think that it puts pressure on us to revise, to update the actual political divide in our country, which is not between Republicans and Democrats. These labels have come out to mean hollowed out husks of themselves. On the left, there's the divide you just talked about. On the right, there's an increasing strain of victimhood itself, right? It's a victimhood culture that's spread in many different directions. Let's for a moment dissolve that distinction and see this through a different lens itself of, the way I'll describe it simply is, are you pro-American or anti-American? But what does that mean? It means, are you pro-truth? Do you believe in the existence of an objective truth? And then we can disagree about the details of how we get there, but do we agree on that basic end, or do we not? And I think that there's a good 20-25% of this country that does not, but at least we can then see that with clarity and smoke that out, rather than talking about Republicans and Democrats. Do you then believe in merit, or do you not? And the optimistic note with which I'll end that is, I think that's not a 50-50 divide in this country. That's something like a 75-25, maybe 80-20 divide, which means that if in the conservative movement we make the next election in 2024 like Reagan in some ways did in 1980 about that underlying actual reality, could be a landslide election and probably the most unifying thing we could deliver to a country that's in bad need of it. But that's, I think, the prism. We have to take off the goggles of partisan politics to actually see that reality. That's the real fissure at the heart of the American politic, not some sort of artificial retrofitted partisan distinction.
The clock is running down, but let's finish on an easy question. What should we be doing with our lives?
Okay, all right. I was waiting. So look, I think that I'll end it in equally lighthearted tone. When I wake up to a country right now, especially my generation, especially younger, I feel like we're like bats. We're like blind bats, lost in a cave, lost in some abyss. We always have been in some ways, but we send out a signal. How does a bat figure out where it is in that cave? It doesn't see it with its own eyes. Sends out sonar, echolocation, and it bounces off something that is true, okay? The fact that I'm a citizen of a nation. The fact that I am a member of this family with two parents who brought me into this world. The fact that I believe in this true God. The fact that I worked hard and created something true in the world. We send out these signals, faith, patriotism, hard work, family, and then it bounces back and it says, okay, I derive my identity from these things. This is where I am. I'm not lost. This is my location. And I think today the moment we live in is one where we send out those signals, but then nothing comes back. Faith is gone. Patriotism is gone. Hard work has basically disappeared. The idea of family has receded. And so then we're lost in that abyss. And so I think what do we do for rediscovering that purpose of life? I think we have to recreate those pillars of truth, that when we send out those signals desperately as we do, that something actually does come back and teach us who we really are so that we're not lost in the desert. And I'll close with this version of it. I'm not a biblical scholar or anything, but the book of Exodus, when the Israelites are lost in the desert, it is when they are lost and cannot see where they are in that desert that they then say, let me go back and be ruled by that Pharaoh that we escaped. And I think that we can complain about big government all we want. The question is actually take that look in the mirror and ask ourselves, what is it that makes us want to bend that knee? It is the fact that we are lost, and the task ahead is, can we find ourselves in that desert? I think we can.
Yes,
but
King
that's the
Charles
task.
is still willing and eager
He's open for business.
to accept if you do decide to bend the knee. Let me finish, apart from saying thank you to Vivek, by making one very quick reflection of my own on this. It seems to me that we've, among other things, fallen into a listlessness because we've given ourselves a task that is impossible and told us it is the purpose. We've told ourselves that endless diversity, inclusion, equity, that everything ending up the same is the purpose. And it's impossible. It's being invited to play a game that cannot be won in this life. And so I submit, in that case, you don't play the game. But it's a powerful invitation which is being put out there to young people because it gives them purpose and much more. Let me finish, since you made a biblical reference, let me make a quasi-religious one. One of the things I hear very often, I've just finished speaking at various universities in the South, and one of the things I hear very often is the conditions are not optimal at the moment. And you can argue that, for instance, there's no reason why somebody should be a capitalist if they cannot accrue capital. It's extremely hard to get onto the housing ladder, much more. Many people have large amounts of student debt, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. My point has repeatedly been to say to students and others, to young Americans, but the conditions never were optimal. One of my favorite sermons was given by C.S. Lewis in October 1939 at the University Church in Oxford. And C.S. Lewis said there, he said, the conditions we find ourselves in are certainly not optimal. That's some British understatement for you. He said they're certainly not optimal. But he said the search for truth and beauty must persist in any case. He says if human beings had put off the search for these things until the conditions were right, the search would never have begun. And as he says, and maybe I'll close on this, as he says in that sermon, he says, the ants have found their own arrangements and presumably have their own pleasure from it. They've decided to accrue some food and a colony. And he says, but we human beings are different. And he gives the most beautiful list. He says, we discuss mathematical theorems in beleaguered cells. We discuss the latest poem whilst marching on the walls of Quebec. We make jokes on scaffolds and comb our hair at the gates of Thermopylae. This is not panache, it's our nature. I'd love it if more young Americans realized that. But in any case, Vivek, it's been a great pleasure. Good luck. I'm rooting for you, and I'm still going to hold you to that promise.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone.
Thank you.